Roughly 1 in 3 lottery winners in America eventually files for bankruptcy. Nearly 4 in 5 former NFL players face serious financial distress within just 2 years of leaving the league. The pattern is so consistent across sudden windfalls, lottery jackpots, professional sports contracts, unexpected inheritances, that psychologists have given it a clinical-sounding name: sudden wealth syndrome. Meanwhile, families who have held fortunes for 100 years or more tend to share a strikingly different daily rhythm. The same modest car for a decade, the same summer house every single year, dinner at the same time, the same 3 restaurants on rotation. Almost nothing about their daily life would make an interesting Instagram post. That contrast isn't a coincidence, and it isn't simply a matter of taste. Today we're examining why old money treats a deliberately uneventful, repetitive life not as a limitation, but as one of its most powerful and least discussed wealth preservation tools. And what real psychological research says about exactly why that works. If you want the real psychology behind generational wealth, not the aesthetic, the actual behavioral engineering underneath it, subscribe now. This channel breaks it all down every week. The treadmill that eats fortunes. To understand why boredom functions as a defense mechanism, you first have to understand the psychological trap it's specifically defending against: the hedonic treadmill. The concept, first studied in depth by psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, describes a consistent pattern in human well-being. People tend to return to a relatively stable baseline level of happiness after both positive and negative life events, no matter how dramatic those events initially feel. Brickman's own research famously tracked lottery winners alongside accident victims who had become paralyzed, and found both groups returned to something close to their prior baseline happiness within a matter of months or years. The euphoria of winning and the devastation of the accident both faded far faster than either group expected. Applied specifically to money, this research explains something that looks paradoxical at first: why acquiring more wealth so often fails to produce lasting satisfaction, and instead produces an escalating hunger for more. A person who suddenly becomes far wealthier tends to upgrade their home, their car, their vacations, and their daily habits to match. And then, within a relatively short window, simply adapts to that new elevated baseline, feeling no more permanently satisfied than before, while now requiring significantly more spending just to maintain the feeling of normal. Financial researchers describe this specific pattern as lifestyle inflation and identify it as one of the single most reliable destroyers of wealth across every income bracket, from lottery winners to career professionals to inherited fortunes alike. Here's the specific trap this creates for anyone managing a large sum of money. Because each new luxury purchase delivers only a temporary emotional boost before fading into the new normal, a person caught on this treadmill is structurally incentivized to keep spending more and more often just to chase the same fleeting high. A pattern indistinguishable at a behavioral level from any other kind of tolerance-building habit. One recent analysis of this dynamic described the thrill of a new luxury purchase as fading within weeks, while the underlying costs, taxes, maintenance, upkeep, remain as a permanent new fixed expense, repeating the entire cycle until the underlying capital is genuinely exhausted. Old money's answer to this trap is, on its surface, almost absurdly simple: refuse to get on the treadmill in the first place. A family that doesn't chase each new luxury upgrade doesn't need to constantly outspend its own prior spending to feel normal, and doesn't tie its sense of well-being to an ever-escalating standard of living, simply never generates the appetite that the hedonic treadmill depends on to keep accelerating. This is, in a very real sense, the psychological engine underneath everything the boring old money lifestyle is designed to protect. The fortunes that prove the rule. If the hedonic treadmill is the theory, the statistics on sudden wealth are the real-world proof. And they're genuinely striking. Research from the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards has found that roughly 1/3 of major lottery winners eventually go broke and declare bankruptcy, with some studies citing figures as high as 60%, depending on the population studied. A widely cited academic study published in the Review of Economics and Statistics tracked roughly 35,000 Florida lottery winners who received relatively modest windfalls, between $50,000 and $150,000, and found that within 5 years, nearly 2,000 of them had filed for bankruptcy, at a rate researchers noted was actually higher than that of the general population, not lower, despite the injection of new capital. A separate analysis of the same broader body of research found something even more counterintuitive. A financial windfall doesn't necessarily prevent eventual bankruptcy at all. It often simply delays it while making the eventual collapse considerably larger because the winner's spending and lifestyle have expanded to match the new, unsustainable baseline in the meantime. Professional athletes show the exact same pattern at an even more extreme scale. Reporting from Sports Illustrated found that 78% of former NFL players face bankruptcy or serious financial stress within just 2 years of retirement, and a study published in the American Economic Review found that roughly 60% of former NBA players encounter significant financial distress within 5 years of leaving the league. Staggering figures for a population that, by definition, has already earned and held large sums of money for years, not simply won it in a single instant. Financial psychologists studying this pattern have coined a specific clinical term for the underlying condition: sudden wealth syndrome, a recognized psychological response to a rapid, unearned increase in wealth associated with identity confusion, strained relationships, and a documented tendency toward poor financial decision-making in the aftermath. Researchers note this syndrome shows up not just among lottery winners and athletes, but increasingly among cryptocurrency traders who've experienced a sudden windfall, and among younger heirs receiving a large, unprepared inheritance. A detail that connects this entire discussion directly back to an earlier video on this channel about the specific curriculum old money families use to prepare heirs for wealth years before they actually receive it. The common thread across every single one of these groups, lottery winners, athletes, unprepared heirs, is the same: a dramatic, exciting change in financial circumstances, absorbed without the psychological infrastructure to metabolize it calmly. Old money's entire cultural instinct toward a deliberately unremarkable, repetitive daily life can be understood in this light as a kind of permanent inoculation against exactly this failure mode, never allowing a financial event, whether a windfall or a market surge, to feel dramatic or destabilizing enough to trigger the same psychological unraveling researchers have documented so consistently elsewhere. This is exactly the kind of research-grounded breakdown this channel exists for. If these numbers surprised you, drop a comment with the word treadmill. It tells me you want more deep dives into the real psychology behind generational wealth. The marshmallow revisited. There's a foundational piece of psychological research that's become almost a cultural shorthand for this entire subject, and it deserves a fair, honest treatment, including its real limitations. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Stanford psychologist Walter Mischel ran what's now known as the marshmallow test. Preschool-age children were offered a choice between eating a single marshmallow immediately or waiting roughly 15 minutes, alone in a room with the marshmallow in front of them, to receive a second one as a reward for waiting. Mischel's early follow-up studies found that children who managed to wait longer tended to show meaningfully better outcomes years later: higher academic performance, better health markers, and stronger emotional regulation as they grew into adolescence and adulthood. This became one of the most famous findings in developmental psychology, widely interpreted as proof that the simple capacity to delay gratification in early childhood predicts long-term life success. But it's important, in the interest of intellectual honesty, to note that later research substantially complicated this picture. A large 2018 replication study, led by researchers including Tyler Watts, tested a far larger and more socioeconomically diverse sample of children than Mischel's original, mostly Stanford-affiliated preschool population, and found that once family income and home environment were properly accounted for, the direct predictive power of the marshmallow test on later outcomes shrank considerably. Researchers studying this replication noted that children from lower-income households may rationally choose to take the immediate reward specifically because their daily experience has taught them that promised future rewards aren't always reliable. Waiting isn't a character flaw in that context. It's an entirely reasonable response to genuine uncertainty about whether the second marshmallow will actually materialize. So, what should we actually take from this research, presented fairly? The core insight that the capacity to comfortably tolerate delay, uncertainty, and a lack of immediate stimulation is closely linked to long-term stability still holds up reasonably well across the broader body of self-control and self-regulation research, even if the original marshmallow test itself turned out to be a less precise predictor than first believed. And this is where the connection to old money's cultivated boredom becomes genuinely interesting. A childhood environment that reliably delivers on its promises, the same house every summer, the same routines, the same reliable presence of resources, is precisely the kind of stable environment the 2018 replication identified as making delayed gratification easier to practice in the first place. In other words, old money's boring, highly predictable childhood environment isn't just a lifestyle preference. It may be functioning as the very precondition that makes patience and long-term thinking easier to develop and sustain in the next generation. Why boredom protects the portfolio. We've covered, in a previous video on this channel, the specific mechanics of old money's investment philosophy. Diversification, patient capital, and resistance to leverage. What we haven't fully covered is the psychological discipline underneath all of it, and boredom sits at the very center of that discipline. Financial behavior researchers consistently identify a specific bias at the root of poor investment decisions. Mental accounting, the tendency to treat money differently depending on where it came from, rather than treating every dollar with the same rational weight. A paycheck earned through steady work tends to get categorized psychologically as serious money, destined for rent, groceries, and bills. A market windfall or an unexpected gain, by contrast, frequently gets mentally filed as found money, money that feels less real and is therefore spent far less carefully on luxuries the person wouldn't otherwise have considered. This bias thrives specifically on excitement and novelty. A dramatic sudden gain, a hot stock tip that pays off, a speculative asset that suddenly spikes, feels different, psychologically, from the slow, steady, largely uneventful growth of a diversified, patiently held portfolio, even when the actual dollar amounts involved are identical. And that emotional feeling of difference is precisely what leads to different, often worse, behavior. Chasing a repeat of the exciting gain instead of quietly reinvesting a boring one. Old money's cultivated boredom functions as a direct counter to this bias. A family that treats every category of income and gain with the same measured, unexciting seriousness, never categorizing any portion of its wealth as fun money simply because of how or when it arrived, never gives the mental accounting bias the emotional foothold it needs to distort decision-making. This is, in effect, the psychological mirror image of the diversification and illiquidity discipline covered in our earlier investment video. A boring relationship with money isn't a side effect of good financial discipline. It's one of the actual mechanisms that produces it. If this reframes how you think about found money versus earned money, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. The billionaire who still eats the same lunch. This principle isn't just theoretical, it shows up consistently and publicly in the actual daily habits of some of the wealthiest and most successful long-term investors alive. Warren Buffett, whose investment philosophy of patient long-term compounding has itself become legendary, has been famously and publicly consistent about maintaining an almost aggressively unremarkable personal routine for decades, living in the same modest Omaha house he purchased in 1958, long after he could have afforded almost any home on earth, and maintaining simple, repetitive, daily food habits that have become something of a running public joke precisely because of how at odds they are with his net worth. This isn't an isolated eccentricity. It's a consistent, decades-long pattern of behavior from someone whose entire professional philosophy is built around resisting exactly the kind of exciting, novelty-seeking impulse that destroys most fortunes. The connection here isn't coincidental. A person whose personal life is already calm, predictable, and free of constant novelty-seeking is, almost by definition, less likely to bring that same novelty-seeking impulse into their financial decision-making. If your daily life doesn't generate cravings for excitement, your investment behavior doesn't need to satisfy that craving either. You're not tempted to chase a speculative trade for the emotional thrill of it, because your baseline emotional needs are already being met by an otherwise calm, stable existence. This is the deeper, more personal version of the boring is a moat principle introduced at the start of this video. It's not simply that old money avoids flashy spending because it wants to preserve capital, though that's certainly part of it. It's that a life engineered to be low on novelty and stimulation produces a mind that's less vulnerable to the specific emotional triggers, excitement, urgency, fear of missing out, that drive almost every documented case of wealth destruction covered so far in this video. The boredom isn't the absence of a life. For families and individuals who practice it deliberately, it's closer to a form of emotional risk management, applied to their own psychology the same way diversification is applied to their portfolio. The gift of predictability, there's a final generational dimension to old money's cultivated boredom that connects directly to the childhood conditioning covered in an earlier video on this channel. And it has less to do with money itself, and more to do with what predictability actually does for a developing child. Developmental research consistently shows that children thrive on routine and predictability. not because novelty is inherently bad for them, but because a stable, reliably repeating environment gives a developing nervous system the safety it needs to take healthy risks elsewhere, socially, academically, creatively. A child who can count on the same bedtime, the same family rituals, the same summer house, and the same reliable presence of resources year after year isn't being deprived of excitement. They're being given a stable enough foundation that they don't need to seek that excitement through financially or emotionally risky behavior later in life, simply to fill a void that unpredictability left behind. This connects directly to the 2018 marshmallow test replication discussed earlier in this video. Children from stable, reliably resourced environments find delayed gratification genuinely easier to practice, not because they're inherently more disciplined, but because their environment has taught them, repeatedly and reliably, that waiting actually pays off. Old money families that maintain the same rituals, the same properties, and the same predictable rhythms across generations aren't simply being nostalgic or resistant to change. They're recreating, deliberately, the exact conditions research suggests make patience and long-term thinking easiest to develop and sustain. There's an important caveat worth stating honestly here, in the same spirit as the earlier marshmallow test discussion. Predictability is a genuine advantage, but it isn't a guarantee, and plenty of children raised in perfectly stable, boring environments still struggle with impulse control, and plenty of children raised amid genuine instability go on to develop remarkable discipline anyway. What the research supports is a tendency, not an ironclad rule, but it's a tendency sophisticated old money families appear to have intuited and deliberately engineered for, long before any of this research existed to describe why it worked. This is the part of old money that rarely gets explained clearly, how deliberate repetition in childhood quietly trains the exact psychological skills that protect a fortune decades later. If you want the mechanism-first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The paradox of compounding. There's one final paradox worth sitting with, because it ties this entire video together. The single most powerful force in all of finance, compounding, is also, almost by definition, one of the most boring processes to actually watch unfold. Compound growth looks, for long stretches of time, like almost nothing is happening at all. A portfolio compounding steadily at a modest annual rate produces a chart that looks flat and unremarkable for years, sometimes decades, before the exponential curve finally becomes visually dramatic near the end of a very long timeline. There is no thrilling middle chapter. There's no dramatic turning point to post about. There's simply years of the same modest, repeated growth, requiring nothing from the investor except the discipline not to interrupt it. This is precisely why the hedonic treadmill and the boredom-tolerant discipline covered throughout this video are, in a sense, the same coin viewed from two different sides. A person who craves novelty, stimulation, and excitement will, almost inevitably, find the actual experience of long-term compounding unbearably tedious, and will be tempted again and again to intervene, trade, chase a hotter opportunity, or spend the gains, rather than simply letting the boring process continue uninterrupted. A person who has cultivated genuine comfort with an uneventful low-stimulation life, by contrast, experiences none of that friction. The multi-decade chart that looks flat to an outside observer doesn't feel frustrating to them at all. It simply feels like an ordinary Tuesday, repeated for 30 years, which is exactly what allows the compounding to run its full course, undisturbed. The actual lesson. Here's what ties every rule in this video together. Nearly every documented case of a fortune collapsing, lottery winners, retired athletes, unprepared heirs, shares the same underlying ingredient: a sudden, exciting disruption to what had been a stable financial and psychological baseline, absorbed by a mind that had never been trained to treat wealth as something calm, boring, and unremarkable in the first place. Old money's deliberately uneventful lifestyle isn't a failure of imagination, and it isn't evidence of a joyless existence. It's a carefully, if often unconsciously, engineered defense against the single most well-documented pattern in the entire psychology of financial ruin: the seductive, expensive pull of excitement. A family that never lets its relationship with money become thrilling never has to survive the inevitable crash that follows every thrill. Old money doesn't just protect its capital through trusts, its heirs through education, and its relationships through governance. It protects all of it at the deepest level through something far simpler and far harder to imitate: the discipline to stay boring, on purpose, for as long as it takes to let time do the rest. If this changed how you think about excitement, stability, and what actually preserves a fortune, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real psychology behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see how this same discipline shows up directly in how old money actually invests its capital, watch the companion video, The Investment Rules That Outlast Stock Markets breaks down the structural side of exactly the patients covered in this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.